I wanted to talk a little bit about Bloodborne. At this point, it is a fairly well-known game, and it's been in the public eye for quite a while when it came out. At this point, a lot of people who are interested in Bloodborne have played through it. Sadly, I haven't quite completed it myself because it's just difficult to find the time. But needless to say, I am very much enjoying the game. One thing that I think about a lot when I'm playing games is immersion, which is interesting because anybody who knows the way I talk about video games, I actually don't really get immersed in video games very much. As much as I love them and I like to analyze them, I don't really feel that I get immersed in them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it's particularly good either. But at the same time, the reason I don't get immersed is because I'm constantly analyzing the game that I'm playing. I'm trying to look at it from multiple angles, trying to analyze the mechanics of the game, how the controls feel, what the aesthetics of the game are, what the sound and music are like, what the actual interacting with the game world's like. Because of those things, I'm almost always at an arm's length and almost never feel like I'm really deep into the game world and just absorbing everything that's happening. Um, which again, not necessarily a bad thing. I'm actually quite okay with that. But at the same time, I do feel like it does dampen the impact of certain aspects of games, specifically horror games. I don't play a lot of them, but I mean, part of the reason I don't is because sometimes they don't have great controls, or at least the old school ones don't have great controls, but I just don't get scared because I'm so analyzing the situation, analyzing the game, and just like, oh, this is a fascinating game I'm playing. Oh, Resident Evil, you're so fascinating, but I'm not sitting there actually immersed in it and being scared. Um, However, Bloodborne seems to have changed that, if ever so slightly. One thing that's really fascinating about that game is the fact that that world's aesthetic is so consistent and so oppressive. Even though the game really begins to open up after you beat a few bosses and you find out there's a lot of different ways you can go, and the actual lore behind the world becomes more interesting. But the world that you're in is so oppressive and so almost suffocating. You see that the streets are just covered in filth. You see dead horses. You see dead bodies. Flies are zipping around. You see, burning candles. You practically feel the stench in the street because of how they present it to you, which I found really fascinating. I found that incredibly striking, and that was the moment when I was like, you know what? I think I can allow myself to be immersed in this game because they've created a world the world I believe I'm looking for is consistent, and they really get you used to that in the first few areas. I was actually found myself talking to my older brother, and I said, you know what? Bloodborne looks really cool, but I'm really bummed about this color palette and how samey these streets are looking. Because again, the aesthetic of the town, it is a town, so it makes sense that a lot of the town areas look similar. Not necessarily that they are structured similar or the map is just replicating itself, but just the actual architecture of the area that you're in looks the same. And I was like, you know what? It makes sense that it's a town, but I'm finding it a little disappointing because I've seen the same thing, seeing similar designs over and over again. So that was kind of disappointing. But as I got deeper into the town and got into the sewers, got up to the bridge, fought the first boss, I started to really appreciate what that similar aesthetic to the town, the each area really meant and why it was important. And the fact that they were very much setting a tone. All these things that you know instinctively when you're playing. Well, I guess if you think about these kind of things, you know them instinctively when you're playing a game. Like this is the type of setup that they're doing. But then when you allow yourself to take a step back and actually be immersed in it, that's when you really begin to feel that oppression that they're trying to place on you. I actually found myself getting slightly nervous while playing the game. It's not a feeling that I'm familiar with when playing video games. I have played quite a bit of Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2, as well as Demon Souls. So I'm very familiar with what kind of the kind of theme of these games and the way that they play and how there's almost always something terrible around the corner that's going to kill you. Yet even while playing those games, I never really felt nervous. I liked them a lot, but I've never really felt nervous or scared or anything like that. But with Bloodborne, I found that I was feeling slightly nervous, which is kind of fascinating. Specifically because this is probably one of my favorite moments of the game. This is a light spoiler, so if you're worried about that, please, please maybe skip ahead for a few, a couple minutes. But um, at the beginning of the game, you climb up a ladder and you hear this terrifying screech. And I was like, oh, that's creepy. I pan the camera around and I can't see anything. I'm like wondering where this is coming from. Later on in the level, I went to a bridge and just started walking down it. And I heard that same screech. And then all of a sudden, this massive monster jumped over the gate and landed right in front of me. And the boss music just started playing. I was like, wow, that was incredible. Um, I was nervous about where that screech came from for the whole time until I got to that boss. And that took me about 2 or 3 hours to get there. So, needless to say, I was not in a state of calmness throughout that whole time, which I found really, really interesting. And again, the fact that I was allowing myself to be immersed in this world, I found that really rewarding. Again, for somebody who plays a lot of games, has played a lot of games over the years, I find it really interesting that being immersed in the world is not something that I do very often, and that after playing games for so long, I decided to actually allow myself to be immersed in this. Um, so yeah, it was a great experience, and I think that actually really lends it. I think that really suggests that maybe immersing yourself and actually taking a step back rather than being incredibly analytical, just letting yourself enjoy what the game is. There's a lot to be said about that. So I think that's something I'm definitely going to try out quite a bit more, and something I'm definitely going to continue doing while playing Bloodborne. Um, the great thing about that too is as you're really immersed and you start to get used to those streets, those grimy streets, and those creepy villagers that that yell at you and scream at you and talk about you being a beast rather than them. Um, that's when the game starts to open up and it throws quite a few different areas at you. You get to go to a creepy forest, a haunted school. Uh, a jail that you kind of wake up in. There's a lot of really strange areas that really change up the games in ways that you just don't expect. And that's also even furthered by the fact that as you keep playing the game, you become more and more aware of the curse that's befallen this town, as well as the Eldritchian horror that's actually permeating everything. I mean, as the game goes on, it's almost like your character becomes more and more insane, which is really interesting. It's a very, very interesting aspect that I think that I knew about, but again, once I allowed myself to be immersed, it became more and more interesting. And every time my character became slightly more insightful as to what was going on, especially after you reach a certain threshold of insight, you start to see things that you didn't see before, and enemies become more powerful. So that starts to make you wonder, maybe things aren't exactly as they seem. Maybe my characters and therefore my extension of myself is becoming more insane as I'm going deeper and deeper into this town. It's a really, really interesting way to present itself. Um, and of course, I've said this to many people, but one of my favorite things about this game, granted it's quite different, but honestly, the way that it looks and the creepy Victorian horror aesthetic that they're going for really reminds me a lot of Castlevania. It I always make the joke that to play modern Castlevania, you buy a PlayStation 4, buy Bloodborne, start listening to Castlevania music, and then play Bloodborne. Unfortunately, as we've seen with Konami's release of the Lords of Shadow series, including the one that came out on the 3DS, they don't really seem to be interested in classic Castlevania anymore, which is a shame. And what I see about Bloodborne is that it seems like they've taken some of the aesthetics from classic Castlevania, not necessarily ripped it from Castlevania, but it's similar. And even the way level progression of the town, the areas around the actual town, and actually going into a terrifying, creepy castle, um, that's where I get my fix for these things. And I think that's part of the reason why I was really enjoying being immersed in this world, because it was really scratching an itch that I hadn't been attended to for years at this point. So yeah, Bloodborne is a really, really interesting game. Of course, as I have to say, it is very challenging, which is goes without saying. It's more about the actual way the game is structured and the way they want you to play, rather than it being really hard. But the game is and can be incredibly frustrating, and I think I've almost rage quit that game about four or five times at this point. So, needless to say, it's definitely interesting if you have a PlayStation 4. But be warned, the game is definitely not for everybody. That's not. I definitely don't want to go into that least thing like, oh, real gamers like Bloodborne. No, it's just the same. Everybody has their own niche, and everybody has something they like and something they don't. Bloodborne's not for everybody. Just like sports games aren't for everybody, racing games aren't for everybody, fighting games aren't for everybody. So yeah, approach this game with caution. But at the same time, if you do play this game, try and take a step back and really immerse yourself. If you happen to have PlayStation ready headphones, give them a shot while you're playing this game, and then have your older brother tap you on the shoulder while they're playing, and then freak out on them. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hopefully, I'll have another one soon. Bye.